Chapter 7 is on the nature of industry. We know that different businesses are in different industries and they seem to have very different characteristics. Well, what are some ways that we can use to organize our thoughts to differentiate between the behavior of certain patterns of one industry type versus another? That's what we're going to explore today, actually for the next few classes. A few years ago, AT&T tried to acquire T-Mobile. This would be the combination of two major mobile phone carriers in the United States. The Department of Justice was looking at this as a monopolistic transaction, which would be anti-competitive. And after a few years and a few $1 million, AT&T decided to call off this proposed merger. And the bottom line was it hurt their profits, and the CEO saw his pay get cut $2 million as a result. So the question is, do you think AT&T should have spent those millions of dollars on the merger plans in the first place? And explain. Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to answer the question for yourself. If not, we'll just do it together. The learning objectives for Chapter 7 are: first, look at the industry measures on the basis of industry structure, conduct, and performance. Secondly, to look at the structure, conduct, performance paradigm and see the various ways that we look at it, the causal and the feedback critique, and see how that relates to our well-known Porter's 5 forces. And then we'll have a preview of where these industry structures fall into patterns and how those patterns have very different economics. Those patterns being perfectly competitive, monopoly, monopolistically competitive, or an oligopoly. First, on industry measures. The structure itself can be quite different. Namely, are there many firms or few firms? What is the relative size and concentration of the industry in the hands of a few? What are the technology and cost conditions of the industry and their players? What are the demand conditions for the product and its competitors? And finally, how hard is it to enter or exit the market? The second grouping are in conduct. This is on the pricing seen in the market, the advertising by competitors in the business, R&D spent by one company versus another, and the level of merger activity between different players in the industry. And finally, performance. We'll look at the profitability of the business itself, and then also the impact of increasing their output and what impact that would have on social welfare. First, in terms of number of firms, some industries have many firms, other industries have few firms. Furthermore, the distribution may be uneven, with many large firms or some that are highly fragmented. So one of the first things we look at is just who's in the industry. And are there many in number, and what's the degree of concentration? In the area of concentration, we have some specific metrics that we can use to guide us in our judgment. The 4-firm concentration ratio is the sales of the 4 top firms compared to the sales of the entire marketplace. So we sum sales for 1, 2, 3, and 4 divided by total market and see what percent we end up with. And the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is 10,000 times the sum of a company's sales divided by the total for the industry squared plus the sales for the second company divided by the sales in total squared. And you do that for all the competitors in the industry and get the sum of those, multiply that times 10,000. And one way to think about it is when you get a number, if it's 10,000, that means you have one dominant competitor that essentially is the entire market, right? That's what 1 times 10,000 would represent, is where one firm is the market. On the other hand, if it's highly fragmented with many, many firms, then we will approach 0, because as we get to an infinite number of firms, no one firm has any appreciable market share to speak of, so we're approaching 0. Here's an example of the ratios in action. So let's assume we have an industry that has 6 firms. So what is the 4-firm concentration ratio? In this case, we know that the 4 largest firms each has $10. So 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 equals 40. It's divided by 50, which are the industry sales. So it's 80%, quite concentrated. Using the HHI, an example is as follows. We have an industry with 3 firms. 2 firms have sales of 10 each. 1 firm has sales of 30. And what is the HHI and what's the 4-firm concentration? HHI is equal to 10,000 times, open bracket, 30 divided by 50, that's the largest firm, squared, plus 10 divided by 50 squared plus 10 divided by 50 squared. And we end with 4,400, and that is moderately concentrated. If it's closer to 10,000, it would be highly concentrated. If it's closer to 0, it would be very fragmented. So that is the situation for this example. But we can also look at different industries and see how that compares with other industry averages for HHI and for firm concentration ratio. Here are some indices for the HHI and the 4 firm concentration, and we see that certain industries are clearly very concentrated. We look at breweries, 90% is in the hands of the largest 4 firms. We look at distilleries, also have 70%, electronic computers, 87%. So certain industries are very concentrated. Others, like furniture or apparel or ready mixed concrete or women's apparel, these are much less concentrated. And the HHIs also reflect that, with the women's apparel being at 174. Remember, that's out of 10,000, so that's quite distributed. So we can see that the HHI and concentration indices have similar objectives, but the measures are arriving at different angles at the problem, but they both directionally show the same observation about the concentration of an industry.